The alarm did not sound like the drills. It sounded wrong, broken, too fast, and I was already running before I understood why. My name is Daniel Voss, and I was the junior liaison officer for the human settlement on Meridian's Rest, a small joint colony built on a rocky moon that 3 different alien powers had once fought over before deciding it was easier to share. I was not a soldier. I was not a diplomat with any real weight behind my title. I filed reports, translated documents, and smoothed over small arguments between traders who did not like the way humans negotiated prices. That morning, none of that mattered, because the alarm was coming from the direction of the schoolhouse. I had been in my quarters finishing a report when the first tremor passed through the floor, faint but wrong, like something heavy had been dropped from a great height. Then the lights along the corridor flickered amber, the color reserved only for emergencies that involved people, not equipment. I grabbed my coat and ran. Meridian's Rest was not a large colony. It had one main promenade, a market district run mostly by a species called the Virel, a small human residential quarter, and a school building we had built ourselves, brick by brick, because we wanted our children to grow up somewhere that felt like home, even if home was 400 light-years away. The school had glass walls facing the courtyard so the teachers could watch the younger children play during the day. I remember thinking as I ran past the market stalls that those glass walls had always felt like such a nice idea. By the time I reached the courtyard, there were already people gathered, and the smell of scorched metal hung in the air. A cargo hauler from a group called the Yasaru Cartel, an old trading conglomerate that handled shipping contracts across this sector, had clipped the edge of the school's outer wall during what witnesses were calling an enforcement stop. The Yasaru had been chasing down a colonial administrator over a shipping dispute, some disagreement about tariffs that had been dragging on for months, and their pursuit vehicle had come in low and fast through a restricted lane that ran directly behind the school. I did not understand the full story yet. All I understood was the sound of a woman crying near the courtyard gate, and a group of teachers ushering children away from a section of collapsed wall, and the flashing lights of the colony's small medical response team as they moved with the kind of speed that told you everything you needed to know about how serious this was. I pushed through the gathering crowd until a security officer put a hand on my chest. "Not past this line," she said. "Let the medical teams work." "I am Colonial Liaison Staff," I said, holding up my badge, though my voice did not sound as steady as I wanted it to. She looked at the badge, then at my face, and something in her expression softened just slightly, the way people's expressions do when they realize you are about to learn something you cannot unlearn. "3 children were caught near the wall when it came down," she said quietly. "They are being treated now. It could have been much worse. Much worse." I turned those words over in my mind as I watched a small stretcher pass by. A boy no older than 7 with a monitoring band around his wrist, his face pale, his mother walking beside him gripping his hand like she was afraid the universe might try to take him again if she let go. I recognized the boy. His name was Oliver, and I had spoken with his father just 2 days earlier about a shipment of textbooks that had been delayed. His father was not with him now. His father was one of the colonial administrators the Yasaru cartel had been chasing. I found the colony director, a calm, tired man named Gregory Finch, standing near the edge of the courtyard speaking in low, controlled tones to a Yasaru representative, a tall, narrow being with pale gray skin and long fingers that moved constantly, nervously, as it spoke. "This was an unfortunate accident," the Yasaru representative was saying. "Our enforcement vehicle experienced a navigational error during a lawful pursuit. We take full responsibility for the damage to colonial property." Finch's voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something I had never heard from him before. "3 children were injured," he said. "This was not damage to property." The Yasaru representative's fingers stopped moving for just a moment. "Yes, of course," it said. "We will file the appropriate compensation forms with the Concord Registry. These things happen, unfortunately, in busy trade corridors. We hope for a swift resolution." I stood there, watching this exchange, and something cold settled into my chest, because I understood, even then, that the Yasaru cartel did not see this as anything more than an inconvenience. A line item, a number to be adjusted in a ledger somewhere. I did not know yet that this single moment, this cold indifference standing in a courtyard still smelling of scorched metal, was about to change everything the galaxy believed about my species. I stayed at the colony's small medical center that night, along with dozens of other residents, waiting for updates. Oliver was going to recover, the doctors said, though he would need time. A younger girl named Ellie had a fractured arm. The third child, a quiet boy named Simon, had been the closest to the collapsing wall, and the doctors were still running scans on him when I finally went home near dawn, exhausted, my mind circling the same image over and over, the image of that Yasaru representative's fingers moving calmly while it spoke about forms and registries. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and opened the colony's communication logs, the ones I had access to as liaison staff, and I began reading the flood of messages that had come in overnight, first from other human colonies, then from human trade envoys stationed across the sector. Then, as the hours passed, from channels I did not usually have access to at all. I want to be honest about something. Humanity had always played a careful game within the Concord, the loose alliance of species that governed trade, diplomacy, and law across this region of space. We were the newest full members, having only received our seat 11 years earlier, and every human representative I had ever met carried themselves with a kind of practiced humility. We did not boast about our fleets. We did not remind anyone of the wars we had fought among ourselves back on Earth. Wars that had taught us things about defense and deterrence that older, calmer species had simply never needed to learn. We smiled, we negotiated, we signed treaties, and we let the older civilizations believe we were still finding our footing. I had always assumed that humility was simply who we were as a people. That night, reading messages that were never meant to reach a junior liaison officer's terminal, I began to understand it was something else entirely. It was a choice. By morning, 3 warships that I had never seen listed in any public registry had entered orbit around Meridian's Rest. They did not fire, they did not threaten, they simply arrived, silent and enormous, and took up position above the colony like a held breath. The Yasaru cartel's local office sent an urgent message to Director Finch within the hour, asking, with noticeably less calm than the previous day, what the meaning of this military presence was. Finch's reply was short. "We are simply making sure our children are safe," he wrote. "I would encourage your organization to consider whether that makes you uncomfortable, and why." I read that message 3 times, sitting alone in my quarters as the pale light of an alien sun rose over Meridian's Rest, and I felt something shift inside me, something between fear and a strange, quiet pride. For the first time since I had joined the colonial service, I understood that I did not fully know my own people. Not really. Not the way I thought I did. And somewhere out among the stars, word was already spreading, moving faster than any ship could travel, carried through message relays and gossip networks and nervous diplomatic cables. Word that humans, the calm, humble, endlessly patient new members of the Concord, had just watched someone injure their children. And humans, it seemed, were done being patient. The Concord Oversight Bureau, the body responsible for handling disputes between member species, contacted Director Finch less than 6 hours after the warships arrived. I was in the room when the call came through, standing near the back because Finch had asked me to keep notes, and I remember the voice on the other end sounding almost bored, the way someone sounds when they are handling a case they have handled 100 times before. "We understand there was an unfortunate accident at your colony," said the representative, a smooth-voiced official from a species called the Denari, known across the Concord for their skill in mediation and their almost total lack of patience for what they considered emotional overreaction. "Please be assured the matter is being logged. The Yasaru cartel has already submitted a compensation offer for the damaged structure and the medical costs involved. We consider this a routine trade corridor incident." Finch did not respond right away. I watched his jaw tighten, watched him take a slow breath before he spoke. 3 children were injured, he said. One of them is still undergoing evaluation. This is not a routine incident to us." The Denari official made a small sound, something between a sigh and a laugh, though I could not tell if it was meant unkindly or simply out of habit. "We understand emotions are running high," it said, "but the Concord operates on precedent and proportionality. No lives were lost. The Yasaru cartel has cooperated fully with our investigators. We would ask that your colony stand down its unauthorized military assets before this escalates into something neither side wants." Finch looked at me then, just briefly, and I understood the look. He was asking me, without words, whether I understood what was happening. I did. The Concord was not going to help us. Not really. To them, this was paperwork, a statistic, a minor disruption in an otherwise stable trade relationship. After the call ended, Finch sat quietly for a long moment before he spoke to me directly for the first time that day. "Voss," he said, "I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it quickly. This colony exists because our government agreed to a set of restraints when we joined the Concord. We do not maintain large visible fleets near civilian settlements. We do not use force to resolve trade disputes. We have followed those restraints for 11 years, longer than I have worked for this administration, because our leadership believed it was important for us to be seen as reasonable, as safe, as a species that could be trusted." "I understand, sir," I said, though I was not entirely sure that I did. "What you may not understand," he continued, "is that those restraints were never really about weakness. They were about choice. We chose to hide what we were capable of, because showing it too early would have made every other species in this Concord afraid of us, before they ever had a chance to know us. But there is one line we drew that nobody outside our government was ever told about. One line that, if crossed, removes every restraint at once." I felt a chill settle over me. "Our children," he said quietly. "That is the line." Over the next 2 days, I watched the colony transform in ways I could barely describe to anyone who was not there to witness it themselves. More ships arrived in orbit, quiet and enormous, moving with a kind of discipline that made the Varel traders in the market district stop their business entirely just to watch the sky. Human communication channels that I had never known existed began routing through my terminal by mistake, overloaded, the traffic too heavy for the usual relays to handle. I read messages between commanders I had never heard of, discussing logistics with a calm, methodical precision that felt entirely different from the panic I expected. There was no panic, there was only preparation. I want to describe one particular exchange I witnessed because it shaped how I understood everything that came afterward. On the second night, a fleet commander named Nathan Ellery, a name I had never encountered before despite working for the Colonial Service for 6 years, sent a direct message to the Yasaru cartel's regional headquarters. I was not supposed to see this message. It reached my terminal only because of a relay error caused by the sheer volume of encrypted traffic passing through the system that week. The message was short. "You have 12 hours to provide a full account of the incident at Meridian's Rest, along with the names and records of every individual involved in the enforcement action that damaged our school and injured our children. We are not asking for compensation. We are not filing a grievance with the Concord Oversight Bureau. We are asking you, directly, to explain yourselves. If you fail to respond within 12 hours, we will assume you have chosen not to." I remember reading that message and feeling my hands go cold, because there was no anger in it. No threats, just a plain, quiet certainty that made it somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. The Yasaru cartel's response came 9 hours later, and it was exactly the kind of response I had expected from the calm, dismissive representative I had watched speak to Finch in the courtyard. They insisted the incident had already been resolved through proper Concord channels. They reminded the human fleet that unauthorized military action against a registered trade organization would violate at least 4 separate treaties. They suggested, politely but firmly, that humanity's continued good standing within the Concord depended on respecting established procedures. I do not think they understood what they were dealing with. I do not think anyone in the Concord truly understood, not yet, because humanity had spent 11 years making sure nobody did. On the third day, Director Finch called a meeting for all colonial staff, and I stood in a crowded briefing room alongside teachers, administrators, medical staff, and traders, listening as he explained, as clearly and calmly as he could, what was about to happen. "I want you to understand this is not about revenge," he said. "It is not about anger, though I think all of us have felt that these past few days. It is about something our government decided a long time ago, something most of you were never told because it was never supposed to matter. When we joined the Concord, we told every other species that we were a peaceful, cooperative people. That was true. It is still true. But peace was never the same thing as weakness, and cooperation was never the same thing as surrender." He paused, looking around the room at faces that were tired, frightened, and waiting. "Every species in this Concord has watched us for 11 years and concluded that we are cautious, because we are new, because we do not yet know our own strength. They are about to learn how wrong that conclusion was." I remember a teacher near the front, a woman named Grace Whitfield who had taught at the school for 4 years and who had helped carry Ellie out of the rubble with her own hands, raising her voice to ask the question everyone in the room was thinking. "What happens now?" she asked. "What happens to the children? To all of us, if this becomes something bigger than a trade dispute?" Finch's answer was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight. "What happens now," he said, "is that for the first time since we joined this alliance, humanity is going to stop pretending to be smaller than we are." That night, I stood outside the colony's medical center, looking up at the sky, watching those enormous silent ships hang above us, like something out of an old story. I thought about Oliver, recovering slowly in his hospital bed. I thought about Ellie, her arm in a sling, still asking her teachers when she could go back to playing in the courtyard. I thought about Simon, the quiet boy who had been closest to the wall, still under observation, his parents sitting beside him around the clock. And I thought about the Yissaru representative's fingers moving calmly as it spoke about compensation forms, as if a child's safety could ever be reduced to a line in a ledger. I did not know exactly what was coming, but I understood, standing there under that strange, crowded sky, that the galaxy was about to learn something about humanity that we had kept carefully hidden for over a decade, and that once it was learned, it could never be unlearned again. On the morning of the fourth day, the sky above Meridian's Rest changed in a way I will never forget for the rest of my life. I had grown used to the sight of the 3 silent warships hanging in orbit, their hulls catching the pale light of our sun, their presence quiet but constant. I had even started to feel a strange comfort in seeing them there each morning when I stepped outside. But on the fourth day, the sky was different. The clouds above the colony seemed to ripple, just slightly, the way water ripples when something enters it from far below the surface. And then, one by one, more ships began to appear, decloaking in perfect formation, filling the orbit around our small moon until the sky itself seemed to hum with their presence. I counted 40 before I lost track. They were not like the aging patrol vessels I had seen in Concord registries, the blocky, practical ships humanity had always shown to the rest of the galaxy. These were sleek, quiet, built with a kind of purposeful elegance that made my chest tighten just looking at them. I later learned they had a name, a program that had been developed in complete secrecy over the better part of 2 decades, funded quietly, tested in systems no other species had ever surveyed. The Concord had always assumed humanity's fleet capacity matched what we showed them. They had never once considered that an entire generation of ships existed that no outside eye had ever seen. Grace Whitfield found me standing in the courtyard, staring up at the sky, and she stood beside me in silence for a long moment before speaking. "I always wondered why our government insisted on those restraint treaties," she said quietly. "I thought it was because we simply did not have anything better to offer. I think I understand now. We were never behind. We were just patient." I did not have a response for her. I simply kept watching the sky. Later that morning, every communication channel across the colony, public and private, carried the same broadcast. It came from Fleet Commander Nathan Ellery, and though I had already seen his name in a message meant for someone else, this was the first time I heard his voice. It was calm, It was steady. It carried none of the fury I had expected, and somehow that made it far more unsettling than anger would have been. To the leadership of the Ysaru cartel, and to every representative of the Concord Oversight Bureau listening on this channel, he began, 3 days ago, your enforcement action injured 3 human children at the colony of Meridian's Rest. We requested an explanation. We requested accountability. You responded with references to treaties and procedures, as though the safety of our children were a matter to be settled through paperwork. He paused, and in that pause, I swear the entire colony seemed to hold its breath. We have honored every restraint asked of us since joining this alliance, he continued. We limited our visible military presence. We resolved every dispute through official channels, even when we believed those channels moved too slowly or cared too little. We did this because we wanted to be trusted, and because we understood that trust between different peoples takes patience to build. But there was one condition attached to all of that patience, one that our government never announced publicly, because we hoped we would never need to. If our children are harmed, that patience ends immediately, and it does not return. I watched the faces of the colonists around me as they listened, and I saw something shift in each of them, a kind of recognition, as though a truth they had always sensed but never spoken aloud was finally being said in the open. The Ysaru cartel's response came within the hour, and this time there was no calm dismissiveness in it. I could hear something new in the voice of their spokesperson, something that had not been there in the courtyard 4 days earlier: fear. We ask for restraint, the Ysaru spokesperson said. This incident was a genuine accident. We have cooperated fully with Concord investigators. Any further escalation would violate the founding treaties of this alliance, treaties your own government agreed to honor. Commander Ellery's reply came almost immediately, and I have thought about his words nearly every day since. You did not break our laws, he said. You broke something older than law, something every parent in every species across this galaxy understands instinctively, even if your leadership has forgotten it. We are not here to discuss treaties today. The Concord Oversight Bureau attempted to intervene one final time, sending an urgent message to every human representative across the sector, warning that any unilateral action would be considered a severe violation of Alliance protocol and could result in humanity's expulsion from the Concord entirely. I was standing beside Director Finch when that message arrived, and I watched him read it twice before setting his tablet down on the table between us. Let them consider it, he said quietly. Let every species in this alliance ask themselves honestly whether they would remain part of an organization that treats injured children as an acceptable cost of doing business. I suspect we are not the only ones who have been wondering that. Something about the way he said it made me realize this was not simply about the Ysaru cartel anymore. It was about a question the entire galaxy was suddenly being forced to answer, whether the rules that governed peace between species meant anything at all if they could not protect the most vulnerable among us. That afternoon, I watched from the colony's observation deck as a portion of the human fleet began to move. They did not move toward Meridian's Rest, since we were already protected. They moved outward, toward the trade routes controlled by the Ysaru cartel, toward the shipping lanes and processing stations that made up the backbone of the cartel's entire economic empire. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. What followed over the next several hours was not chaos. It was not the kind of destructive fury I had imagined when I first read Commander Ellery's warning. It was something far more precise, far more deliberate, and in some strange way, far more frightening because of that precision. Human vessels moved through Ysaru shipping lanes and disabled cargo haulers with careful, targeted strikes that left crews unharmed but stranded, their engines and weapons systems rendered useless. Communication relays that the cartel used to coordinate its trade operations went dark, one after another, not destroyed but simply overridden, taken offline by systems our engineers had clearly designed years in advance for exactly this purpose. Financial networks the cartel relied on to move currency across systems froze entirely, locked by encrypted countermeasures that Concord analysts would later admit they had never even known humanity possessed. It was, I realized as I watched the reports come in, a demonstration, Not of destruction, but of complete and total capability. Humanity was showing the Yasaru cartel, and every other species watching, that we could reach into every part of their operation and stop it entirely, without a single life lost, simply because we chose to. By evening, the Yasaru cartel's regional headquarters sent an emergency message directly to Director Finch, bypassing the Concord Oversight Bureau entirely. Their spokesperson's voice had lost every trace of the calm indifference I remembered from the courtyard. "We are prepared to discuss terms," it said. "Please, we are prepared to discuss whatever terms you require." Finch looked at me across the room, and for the first time since the incident began, I saw something in his expression that was not quite relief, but was close to it. "Now," he said quietly, "they are ready to listen." I stepped outside once more that evening, and the sky above Meridian's Rest was full of ships, human ships, more of them than I had ever imagined my own species possessed. And for the first time since the wall of that school had come down, I felt something other than fear or grief settle into my chest. I felt the strange, heavy weight of understanding exactly what my people were capable of, and exactly why we had spent so long making sure the rest of the galaxy never had to find out. The negotiations began the following morning, though calling them negotiations feels generous, considering how little room the Yasaru cartel actually had to negotiate anything. I was asked to sit in as a recording officer for the first session, a task I accepted only because Director Finch trusted me and because, after everything that had happened, I wanted to understand exactly how this would end. The meeting took place aboard one of the human vessels now stationed above Meridian's Rest, a ship called the Halden, and I remember stepping onto its deck and feeling, for the first time, a strange sense of pride mixed with unease, because everything about the ship, its quiet efficiency, its calm crew, its unfamiliar systems, reminded me that I had spent my entire career believing I understood my own people, when in truth I had only ever seen the smallest part of what we were. Commander Nathan Ellery led the human delegation. He was younger than I expected, with a calm, unreadable face, and eyes that seemed to measure everything without ever revealing what conclusion he had reached. Beside him sat two representatives from the human government's diplomatic corps, along with an older woman named Eleanor Voss, no relation to me despite the shared name, who I later learned had spent decades studying alien governance structures, specifically so humanity would never again be caught unprepared in a moment like this one. The Yasaru cartel sent their highest surviving authority, a figure known as the First Overseer, an old and clearly frightened member of their species, who represented what I came to understand was a deeply hereditary power structure. Cartel leadership among the Yasaru was not elected or earned through merit. It passed down through bloodlines, entire family lines holding control over shipping routes, financial systems, and enforcement divisions for generations. The enforcement crew responsible for the incident at Meridian's Rest, I learned, had been directly overseen by a mid-level family branch of the cartel's ruling structure, a group that had grown so accustomed to operating without consequence that they had never once considered that a colonial school might be anything more than an obstacle in a busy trade corridor. Commander Ellery opened the session without any of the diplomatic softness I had grown used to hearing from human representatives over the years. "We are not here to discuss compensation," he said. "We are not here to discuss treaties, precedent, or procedure. We are here to discuss what happens to an organization that allowed a child to be harmed and responded by reaching for paperwork instead of responsibility." The First Overseer's voice trembled slightly as it spoke. "We understand the severity of the incident," it said. "We are prepared to remove the enforcement division responsible, to compensate the colony fully, and to submit to any inspection process the Concord requires." Commander Ellery was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That is not enough," he said. The room grew very still. I watched Eleanor Voss glance at the commander, though her expression gave nothing away, and I understood then that whatever was about to happen had already been decided long before this meeting began. "Your organization operates on inherited authority," Ellery continued. "The families who control your shipping routes, your enforcement divisions, your financial systems, they do not answer to merit or accountability. They answer to bloodline. which means responsibility in your structure is not individual, it is generational. The family that oversaw the operation which harmed our children did not simply fail to train careful pilots. They built a culture, passed down through generations of leadership, that treated the safety of outsiders, including children, as an acceptable cost of maintaining efficient trade. That culture does not end with a single reassignment. I remember feeling a chill at those words, because I understood, even as he spoke them, exactly what was coming. Effective immediately, Ellery said. Every member of the ruling family responsible for the enforcement division involved in this incident will be removed from all positions of authority within the Yasaru cartel, permanently, across every branch of your organization. Their holdings will be transferred to independent oversight until new leadership can be established through a process that does not depend on inherited bloodline authority. This is not a punishment we are inflicting out of anger. It is a condition for the continued existence of your organization within any trade network humanity participates in. The first overseer's fingers, I noticed, had gone completely still, the nervous movement I remembered from the courtyard, entirely absent now, replaced by something that looked very much like genuine fear. "You are asking us to dismantle our entire governing structure," it said. "I am telling you," Ellery replied, "that the alternative is far worse for your organization than the loss of one family's authority. We have already demonstrated, over the past 2 days, exactly how thoroughly we can dismantle every operation your cartel depends on. What we are offering you now is a choice. Remove the family responsible yourselves, transfer their authority to new leadership, and submit to independent oversight, or we will simply do it for you, and I promise you, our version of that process will not leave room for negotiation of any kind." The negotiations continued for several more hours, but the outcome had already been decided in that single exchange. Over the following days, I watched, through official reports and colonial briefings, as the Yasaru cartel's entire governing family, the one directly responsible for the enforcement division that had caused the incident at Meridian's Rest, was systematically removed from every position of power they held. Their shipping contracts were transferred to independent management. Their financial holdings were placed under Concord oversight, a rare move that the Bureau agreed to only after seeing, in full detail, exactly what humanity had been capable of the entire time it had quietly played along with Concord procedure. I want to describe something that struck me deeply during this period, something that I think matters more than the mechanics of the political fallout itself. Humanity did not seek to harm anyone during this process. No lives were taken. No family members were punished simply for sharing a bloodline with those responsible. Instead, what happened was something more precise and, in its own way, more devastating to an organization built entirely on inherited privilege. The family lost every position of authority they had held for generations. Their name, once respected and feared across Yasaru trade networks, became a word associated with carelessness and consequence. Their descendants would grow up without the power their ancestors had always assumed was permanent, their future rewritten entirely by a single moment of indifference toward the safety of children who were never supposed to matter to their calculations. This, I came to understand, was the meaning behind the message that had spread across diplomatic channels throughout the crisis. A phrase translated from an old human expression that some enterprising Concord linguist had picked up during the negotiations and shared, apparently without authorization, across dozens of species communication networks. "Harm our children, and we will not simply respond to you. We will remove the entire structure that allowed you to believe such harm was acceptable, so thoroughly that nothing of that structure's authority remains for the generations that follow." I sat with Eleanor Voss briefly during a break in the negotiations, and I asked her, somewhat nervously, whether this response felt proportionate to her, whether removing an entire family's generational authority truly matched the scale of what had happened at the school. She considered the question carefully before answering. "I think the real question," she said, "is not whether this response matches the scale of the incident. I think the real question is whether the Yasaru cartel would have ever taken the safety of colonial children seriously if we had responded the way the Concord Oversight Bureau wanted us to, with paperwork, apologies, and compensation forms. Sometimes the only way to teach a culture that has never faced consequences is to make the cost of carelessness impossible to ignore. I thought about Oliver, still recovering slowly at the colony's medical center. I thought about Ellie, whose arm had finally come out of its sling that same week. I thought about Simon, the quiet boy who had been closest to the wall, whose parents told me during a brief visit that he had started sleeping through the night again for the first time since the incident. And I thought about the Yisaru representative in the courtyard, its fingers moving calmly as it spoke about forms and registries, as though a child's safety had ever been something that could simply be logged and filed away. News of what happened at Meridian's Rest spread across the Concord within days, and I began to notice something subtle in the diplomatic messages that reached the colony afterward, a shift in tone from other species representatives, a new carefulness in how they discussed trade disputes involving human settlements. The Concord Oversight Bureau, I learned, had quietly begun drafting amendments to its founding treaties, clarifying exactly what protections were owed to civilian populations, particularly children, in any territory where member species maintained settlements. Humanity had spent 11 years being careful, patient, and quiet about what we were truly capable of. In the span of 5 days, we had shown the entire galaxy exactly why that patience had never been a sign of weakness. 3 weeks after the incident, the school at Meridian's Rest reopened, and I made a point of standing at the edge of the courtyard that morning, watching the children arrive in small, hesitant groups, their parents walking beside them a little closer than usual, a little more watchful than before. The wall had been rebuilt, stronger this time, reinforced with materials the colonial engineers had never bothered installing before, because nobody had imagined they would ever need them. The glass panels facing the courtyard remained, though now they were layered with a subtle protective coating that caught the light differently, a small, quiet reminder of everything that had happened. I watched Oliver walk through the gate that morning, still moving a bit carefully, still favoring one side slightly, but walking on his own, his father beside him for the first time in weeks, the two of them talking quietly about something that made the boy laugh. I had not heard a child laugh at that school since the day of the incident, and I stood there longer than I probably should have, just listening to it. Ellie arrived a few minutes later, her arm free of any sling now, swinging both arms as she ran ahead of her mother toward a small group of friends waiting near the courtyard's far corner. And Simon, the quiet boy who had been closest to the wall, walked in holding his mother's hand, his eyes moving carefully across the rebuilt structure, before settling, finally, on the familiar sight of his classroom door. He let go of his mother's hand at the threshold, just for a moment, and stepped inside on his own. I found Grace Whitfield afterward, standing near the courtyard entrance, watching the same scene I had just watched, and she looked at me with an expression that mixed exhaustion and something gentler underneath it. "It feels strange," she said, "teaching again in this building, knowing what it took to make it safe." I did not have a good answer for her, so I simply stood beside her in silence for a while, the way she had stood beside me weeks earlier when the fleet first arrived. Over the following months, I watched the broader consequences of what had happened at Meridian's Rest ripple outward across the Concord, in ways I had not fully anticipated. The Yisaru cartel, stripped of its most powerful ruling family and placed under independent oversight, restructured itself slowly, painfully, under conditions that Concord auditors monitored closely to ensure no similar culture of carelessness could take root again. I read reports of new leadership within the cartel actively reaching out to human colonial administrators, requesting guidance on safety protocols near civilian settlements, a request that would have seemed almost unthinkable a year earlier. The Concord Oversight Bureau, to its credit, did not simply return to business as usual. I read through the drafted treaty amendments myself, forwarded to colonial staff for review, and found language that had never existed before, specific protections for children and civilian populations that no species had ever felt necessary to write into law until humanity demonstrated exactly what could happen when those protections were treated as optional. Other species, I learned, had begun quietly reviewing their own enforcement protocols near shared settlements, unwilling to risk finding themselves in a position similar to the one the Yasaru cartel had faced. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say about what happened during those 5 days. I am not entirely comfortable with everything humanity did. I do not think comfort was ever the point. I watched fleet commanders and diplomatic officials carry out a response that was precise, controlled, and largely bloodless, and yet I also watched the weight of that response settle onto every human face I encountered during those weeks, a heaviness that never quite lifted, even after the negotiations concluded successfully. Nobody I spoke to, not Commander Ellery, not Eleanor Voss, not Director Finch, ever spoke about what happened with anything resembling pride. They spoke about it the way people speak about something necessary and terrible in equal measure, a line that had to be drawn because the alternative, allowing our children's safety to be treated as negotiable, was simply unacceptable. I asked Director Finch about this directly, several weeks after the school reopened, during a quiet evening when the colony finally felt something close to normal again. "Do you think we did the right thing?" I asked him. He considered the question for a long time before answering, longer than I expected. "I think we did the only thing our government believed it could do," he said. "Given the choice between letting an organization believe our children's safety was simply a cost of doing business, or making sure nobody in this galaxy ever makes that mistake again. I do not think there was pride in what we did. I think there was necessity, and I think there is a difference between the two that matters more than people often realize." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, especially during the quiet evenings when I walked past the school and heard children's voices drifting from the courtyard, laughter mixed with the ordinary sounds of a colony slowly healing itself. I think what struck me most, looking back on everything that happened, was not the scale of humanity's hidden capability, though that certainly changed how I understood my own people forever. What struck me most was the restraint that had come before it, the 11 years of careful, patient diplomacy that had allowed humanity to build trust across an entire alliance of species before ever revealing what we were truly capable of. We had chosen, for over a decade, to appear smaller than we were, not out of weakness, but out of a genuine desire to be understood as partners rather than threats. And when that trust was tested in the worst possible way, when the safety of our children was treated as an afterthought by an organization that had never once considered the cost of its own carelessness, humanity did not simply react with anger. We reacted with precision, with clarity, and with a message that every species across the Concord would carry with them from that point forward. I visited Simon's family one final time before I was reassigned to a different colonial posting several months later, and I found the boy sitting in the courtyard, drawing quietly in a notebook while his classmates played nearby. He looked up when I approached, and I asked him, gently, how he was feeling. "Better," he said, and then, after a pause, he added something that I have carried with me ever since. "I used to be scared that nobody would do anything if something bad happened again. Now I know they would." I did not have the heart to explain to him everything that phrase truly meant, the weight of what it had cost to earn that certainty, the careful, terrible precision with which an entire organization had been dismantled to protect a promise most people never even knew existed until the day it was tested. But I understood, standing there in that rebuilt courtyard, listening to the ordinary sound of children playing under a sky that had once been filled with silent, waiting ships, exactly why humanity had spent so long hiding its true strength from the rest of the galaxy. It was never about surprising our enemies. It was about making sure that when the moment finally came, when the only thing that mattered was protecting the smallest and most vulnerable among us, there would be no question, no hesitation, and no mercy for anyone who believed our children's safety was ever something they could simply afford to overlook. Harm our children, and there will be no lineage left to carry your name forward. That was never meant as a threat spoken in anger. It was a promise, quiet and absolute, kept by a people who had chosen patience for 11 long years, waiting for a day they hoped would never come, and answering it, when it finally did, with everything they had spent that patience carefully preparing.